morning, everybody. I thought I've kept a fairly low profile, but I thought it might be worth showing my face from the point of view of organising the subject talks each month. So if any of you would like to give a talk yourself or know somebody suitable, I'm the face to approach. Please, if you do that, would you give me details and phone numbers and everything else? I often get people come to me with little envelopes and I heard a brilliant person such and such, but they don't give me any details and it's quite difficult to chase them up. But it's with great pleasure this morning that I'd like to introduce to you Gareth Williams, and he's going to talk to you about an introduction to Shropshire country houses. Gareth is passionate about sustainable heritage and is widely acclaimed speaker on a variety of subjects in his field. In fact, I'm sure some of you will have heard him before. He read History of Art at the University of Manchester, where he graduated with a first-class honours and later read his Masters. He gained a solid grounding in the commercial art world, working with 2 international auction houses, latterly spending 5 fascinating years as the regional director of Sotheby's. After a spell working with the National Trust in Yorkshire, Gareth was appointed the Curator and Head of Learning at Weston Park Foundation in 2006 and has received a Heart of England Tourist Award for his successful development of an international cultural tourism at the property. In addition to overseeing Weston's internationally important collections, he also undertakes consultancy work and shares Weston Park's experience at other private heritage properties in the UK and beyond. As a lecturer, Gareth's ability to convey a sense of enthusiasm and extraordinary detail to audiences of all backgrounds is renowned, and he's travelled very widely as a result. In the United States, he's lectured to audiences such as the Royal Oak Foundation and at Colonial Williamsburg. And whilst in the UK, he's spoken regularly to Art Fund and NADFAS groups. And he's been a guest lecturer at the Attingham Summer School. So I know that we're in for a treat, and we're very grateful for Gareth giving up his time like this, because he's certainly well known on the circuit of lectures. So thank you very much, Gareth, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you very much, Meredith, for that very kind introduction, and a very good morning to you all. It's wonderful to see so many of you this Monday morning, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, sat here in the Theatre Severn. There is one conspicuous absence from my talk this morning in terms of houses, which some of you who have been perhaps reading up from Francis Leach's County Seats of Shropshire of 1891, or Stanley Leighton's book of the first decade of the 20th century, where he writes about Shropshire houses. He includes Weston Park in that book, as did Francis Leach. Weston, though, although the family, the Earls of Bradford, had very strong connections with Shropshire, taking their title from the Bradford Hundred of Shropshire, Weston is geographically, in fact, just over the county border into Staffordshire. So I'm being a purist this morning, and I'm not going to make reference to that house beyond saying we would very warmly welcome you either as individuals or as a group if you wanted to come across and see the house during our open season. We're now open right through till the beginning of September, and I've left some leaflets outside there. We are a house which is a member property of the Historic Houses Association, so if you're an HHA friend, you get in free of charge. And there's a lot of other HHA properties out there, including some of the big ones like Blenheim, that are also members, so it's something that might be worth thinking about if you're not already a friend. Where Shropshire houses are concerned, though, when we start to think about the geographical area of Shropshire in which we're considering those houses, we're looking at the largest inland county in England, an area which is bounded on the one side by Wales, on the other sides by Cheshire to the north, Staffordshire to the east, and by Herefordshire and Worcestershire to the south. And it's a county which is largely defined by those other neighbours that it has, and also, of course, by the topography of the county itself. The land that we've got in the south of the county being predominantly hill land, and of course in the north, mainly the fertile plains extensively used for dairying. The The River Severn, of course, runs across the county, forming its great loop around Shrewsbury, where we are now, and then disappearing out through under Arn Bridge, as it was from the 18th century, down through Bridge North and out of the county. Those Welsh borders for Shropshire were very, very important in the development of early houses, and of course some of the early fortified sites, aside from houses, within the county. Underneath the landmass as well, we have not only some of the minerals which were used to build some of the houses, but also minerals which were essential in the development of trade and industry in the county from very early stages right through to the real peak in the so-called Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, where much of the money that was made in Shropshire found its way to some of the landowners who owned the land that had the minerals and who spent that money very wisely, as we might think today, in building great houses upon their estates. There's no Chatsworth in Shropshire. There is no Castle Howard. There's no vast great houses of the type that we think about when we think of the kind of houses that overseas visitors perhaps come to this country for. And one of the other essentials of Shropshire is there are still so many private country houses in the county, which really does make it something of an unknown in terms of the houses that we have. But when we start looking at the individual houses, we realise that actually, if we look at a timeline of Shropshire's houses, we've got some very important houses in terms of the chronology of domestic building in Britain. Stokesay Castle, of course, in the south of the county, a building which followed hot on the heels of Edward I's suppressions of the Welsh. It was a building which leases were acquired in the 1280s by Lawrence de Ludlow, a wool merchant, someone who was making money from trade in the wool industry, which was so important in medieval and Tudor Shropshire. He established himself at Stokesay Castle, which he received a licence to crenellate in 1291. That would have probably marked the completion of much of the work on the building, built from local siltstone in its lower stories, and the Great Hall, which you can see both in the upper slide here to the right of the image there, with those great windows looking out across a moat. Great windows, though, which of course just a generation earlier would not have been a possibility for fear of marauders coming across the borders. It's very much a house which is talking, although it is a crenellated building and it's effectively a fortified building, it's a building which is talking about peaceful times, and peaceful times which enabled houses to be built more for domestic occupation than for defensive means. Stokesay in the 17th century was the home of Samuel Baldwin, and he was the man who, in the 1670s, altered the castle, building the very picturesque jetted gatehouse and making other alterations to make the house more comfortable in 17th century terms for domestic occupation. From the 17th century, though, for a long period of time, the house was used as a farm. And so it remained up until the early years of the 19th century, when the Shropshire antiquarian, Mrs. Stackhouse Acton, got quite excited about the state of dereliction that the building was falling into, and she remonstrated quite extensively with its owner, the Earl of Craven, who was an absentee landowner, settled in the south of England and in Warwickshire at Combe Abbey, and she urged him to possibly sell the building. As the 19th century progressed, though, the agricultural depression, which was such a feature for those that were reliant upon agricultural incomes to sustain their lifestyle, such as the Earl of Craven, it was found to be a necessity for him, as an agriculturally based landowner, to perhaps sell some of his Shropshire estates at a distance so that he could gain the capital to sustain his lifestyle. So he sold Stokesay in 1869, and it was acquired by a man who had made money from trade, John Darby Allcroft. He was a Worcester and London glove manufacturer. He was also an early member of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, and undertook a very sensitive restoration of Stokesay at that time. He acquired with it an extensive agricultural estate, but chose not to develop this as his seat, but when he finally acquired the right site, to build anew about 2 miles further away from Stokesay Castle, with a building that he christened Stokesay Court. This very large house, quite a contrast in many respects, of course, to Stokesay Castle, which remains essentially a medieval house. This is, in every sense, the self-made Victorian man's palace of its age. It was designed by an architect called Thomas Harris, who was essentially an architectural theorist, who did a lot of publications on architecture, but actually very few buildings were actually constructed to his designs. One very close to Stokesay, Bedstone Court, was built for the Ripley family, a family that had made money in the textile industry in Yorkshire. And up in Yorkshire, Milnerfield, a house built for Titus Salt, was another of Thomas Harris's buildings. Stokesay, though, was probably the most expensive of his buildings. It cost over £100,000, a huge sum of money in the 1870s, 1880s. And it's a very interesting building, not only for the lavish use of money in terms of its internal fit, and this is the great central hall, the big circulation space around which most of the big rooms are created, but it also has a very structured definition in terms of the social hierarchies within the house and divisions within society. A bachelor's wing at one end of the house, and at a completely different end of the house, a ladies' wing, maintaining propriety in the way that the house was built. And of course, there's that essential service wing, making sure that the house functioned almost as a machine, like a hotel, looking after its guests in the way that it cares for people. Today, of course, the house is very well known to a wide audience, having from 2004 been used as the main location for the film Atonement with Keira Knightley and James McAvoy. If we take ourselves back in time again, though, and think more about the fortified houses, the early houses, we're very lucky in Shropshire that only about 15 miles up the road, 20 miles up the road from Stokesay Court, Stokesay Castle, is another fortified manor house, and another important fortified manor house. This is Acton Burnell Castle, 8 miles to the south of Shrewsbury. Depicted here on a 1730s engraving, when the building was at that stage a ruin. But it had been built for one of the main courtiers, one of the main trusted political advisors of Edward I, the man who suppressed the Welsh from the 1280s. And it was built with licence to crenellate in 1284. Very, very early building, very sophisticated building, and unsurprisingly so because its builder, Robert Burnell, the Bishop of Bath and Wells, was a well-travelled man, and a man who had access to all of the main court architects and craftsmen to help him in his building. So when we look around that building today, it's now looked after by English Heritage. If you go and walk around the site, you see interesting details, including some of the details at the foot of the towers here, that very wide moulding that you can see around there. That also figures on Edward I's Carnarvon Castle. The tracery that's used in the Great Hall, that you can see these 3 large windows here, is derived from tracery in the Great Hall at Conway Castle, another of Edward I's great building campaigns. But this particular type of building, sophisticated as it was in the 13th century, was soon to be bypassed for another kind of domestic dwelling, which you can see peeping out to the right-hand side of the slide there. And that's the beginnings of Acton Burnell Hall, the house that's today used by Concord College, and which was in the 17th century the home of the Lee family, and then from the later 17th century of their descendants, the Smythes, later Bruce Smythe family, who developed the house on a consistent basis over the next 200 years. The original house you can see in the lower slide. It's actually the 3 bays with the bay window at the centre there. That's the building which is peeping out in the previous image. And it's a building which was altered for Sir Edward Smythe, the 4th Baronet, in 1753 by William Baker of Audlem, a gentleman architect who had ideas of Rococo style and an early Palladian style, which he was trying to bring into the houses that he worked on. The Smythes were a Catholic family, and this was something which was reflected in some of the architects that they used. In 1814, after the family moved back to the house, they brought in the London Catholic architect John Tasker to rebuild the house for them. And Tasker added on the Ionic portico that you can see in the upper image there, and he also added on a whole bay onto the house that you can see here. Quite different floor levels are going on there compared to the earlier 3-bay block. So quite a transition of the house to make it much more fashionably Greek revival and to meet with early 19th century tastes. Around the park at Acton Burnell around the house, sorry, at Acton Burnell is a very interesting landscape park as well, which was well depicted in two aquatints of the early years of the 19th century by an artist called Edward Orme. And he depicts not only the house, which you can see in the little inset at the top, and that's before Tasker got to it, so you can see the three bays with a bay window on the side of it. And you can also see Acton Burnell Castle up there in the background, hiding away in the trees. The castle by that stage had become an incident in the landscape park, a feature to be admired. And there are, further from the house, two great lakes, Shadwell Lake and the pool, over which you can see are follies peeping out from the trees looking over the lake. Some of those follies still survive. There's a rather handsome little grotto, rather like a stone igloo that you see on the left-hand side there, decorated with shellwork, which, unsurprisingly for a Catholic family, is depicting the marriage at Cana, the turning of water into wine and the shell decoration within it. And also the Keeper's Lodge, which I show you on the right-hand side there, or Blackdick's Tower as it's sometimes known. It's now known as the Sham Castle. That, interestingly enough, is a building which has three towers. It's trilobal form, possibly emblematic of the Trinity, very appropriate for a Catholic family. That's actually currently on the market. Its lease is with Stratton Parker. So if any of you are feeling particularly flush and you've got £750,000, you can perhaps take the remnant of its lease. If we move into Shrewsbury, though, and very much into Shrewsbury as it now is, this is a building which is now on Monkmoor Road, but originally was built in the fields to the east of Shrewsbury Abbey, and it's the Whitehall, a building which owes its existence to that fundamental event, really, in the development of the English country house, the dissolution of the monasteries in the first half of the 16th century. This was a building which was built on former abbey lands by a very rich lawyer. And to be a lawyer at the time of the dissolution was rather a useful profession because, of course, there was so much land exchange going on that being a lawyer was a pretty sure bet of a profession in which you could get rich fairly quickly. Richard Prince did incredibly well, and in the 1570s built this house, supposedly from stones, from some of the abbey's domestic buildings. An interesting building, as it remains today, largely unchanged from this watercolour, which dates from the 1790s. The building has its little gatehouse, which gives access off what is now Monkmoor Road, but originally was down a tree-lined avenue which went down to the back of the abbey, to the east end of the abbey. The dovecote, that still remains today. The little gazebo's gone, unfortunately, which is a great shame. But the building itself is of great interest because it is the earliest dated example in Britain of a double-piled house. When I say a double-piled house, I mean a house which is not one room's thickness, but 2 rooms in thickness, which was something which, after the early Tudor period, when houses tended to be possibly C-shaped or E-shaped, but of 1 room's thickness, the 17th century ushered in a period where double pile was de rigueur, effectively, and this is the very earliest dated house of that kind. Very similar to Acton Hall as well, which is of a similar date, albeit that this one has a rather wonderful cupola rising out there and giving splendid views, as it still does today, over Shrewsbury. Up in the north of the county, John Ingleby, the watercolourist who had depicted Whitehall in the 1790s, was able to depict this very handsome house. I'm afraid if we went to the site that he was standing on today, we wouldn't see that house because it was burned down in 1918. This is Park Hall near Oswestry, a house which was built for Thomas Powell in about 1600. Powell was a woolen merchant, so again somebody that was rich from the wool trade, and he built this spectacular half-timbered house. Jetted construction with, as the building rose, its stories progressing further out, giving additional floor space, and with a riot of different timber decoration in the facades which it presented to the world. A really wonderful building which was extended out of almost all recognition on the garden side, that's on the left-hand side of this image, in the 19th century, in the 1880s, by an architect called Thomas Lockwood from Chester. But the front of it, up until 1918, looked very similar to as it's seen there. Our most wonderful surviving house in Shropshire of the half-timbered variety, a house which, when I say surviving, it really is, I think, only surviving at the moment, is Pitchford Hall. A spectacular house of several different dates, but a building which once again owes its existence to the wool trade in Shropshire. The west wing of the house, which you can just see here out of shot, this is a late 19th century photograph, so apologies for the fact that it's a little bit blurry, but the west wing here, you can see it's a very regular timber-framed construction with verticals and a very definite horizontal there. That's known as close studding construction of a house. And that's the earliest part of the building, which is thought to date from the 15th century, when Thomas Otley, draper of Shrewsbury, bought the house. His grandson, Adam Otley, in the 1540s, added on, it seems, the other wing here and this other additional stroke to make the great C-shaped courtyard. This is very interesting because we know that in 1549, John Sandford of Shrewsbury, who was a carpenter, very much of the Shrewsbury school of carpentry, who delighted in buildings that had a jetted construction projecting out, who delighted in buildings with barley twist columns on the corners of the building, and inset decorative quatrefoil motifs cut into the beams, something that you'll see in Shrewsbury on, in fact, the Draper's Hall. You'll see it on other buildings around the town of this date, and it's very much attributed to the Sandford family. John Sandford, in 1549, took a lease of the premises at Pitchford so that that house could be built. So he's pretty much definitely associated with the building. As we see Pitchford today, and in this late 19th century photograph though, it is very much a restoration from the late 19th century. These windows, which you see here, the casement windows, are restorations done by George Devey, a Victorian architect, working for Lady Louisa Coates, the owner of the house, in the late 19th century. In the early 19th century, if we'd seen the house, we would have seen it looking like this. And this is rather an amusing watercolour, which is from a book by Joseph Nash, a romantic book full of pictures of mansions of England in the olden time. And so he shows this Tudor party here on the bridge. What he forgets to work on in terms of airbrushing out, or a little bit of change with his pencil, are the windows, which are in fact Georgian sash windows from the 18th century, rather incongruous on a building that he's otherwise trying to depict as this wonderful Tudor house. But indeed, until George Devey did his restoration in the 19th century, the house had these Georgian sash windows put on for the then Adam Otley in the 18th century, when Shrewsbury architect Thomas Farnells Pritchard was working on the house for him. Pritchard's work at Pitchford also included some rather wonderful plaster decoration in the tree house, which is still to be seen in the grounds of the house, settled in the boughs of an enormous great lime tree in the garden. It's a building which probably dates from the first half of the 17th century, possibly the 1620s, 1630s. We know that in Shropshire, from an estate map that survives, at Dot Hill, which was to the north of Wellington, there were a pair of similar arbours in trees in the grounds of that house. So that seems to be a date for the tree house at Pitchford. The house at Pitchford, though, of course, was very sadly sold in 1992 by the eventual descendants of the Otleys, and was bought by an overseas buyer who has never been resident in the house, and the building is not looking in a very happy state of repair. Hopefully things will be addressed soon. Up in the north of the county, though, in the 16th century, there were some quite exciting things going on in terms of building for the Corbet family there. The Corbets, a family who are said to have come over as two brothers with William the Conqueror into Shropshire and to have gained great lands in the county, have a huge landholding in North Shropshire, even still to this day. And one of the families had married in the 14th century the heiress of the Torret family, or Torre family, who lived at Moreton, near Shawbury. The estate there took their name as Moreton Corbet. Their castle, remnants of which you can see here to the left-hand side of this picture, was developed over a long period of time, essentially a medieval site, but one which was developed for different successive members of the family. Sir Andrew Corbet, in the early years of the 16th century, was involved with the Council of the Welsh Marches, and so he effected quite a considerable rebuilding of some of the structures around the older buildings. His son, though, Robert, was greatly interested in architecture. He had involved himself in a diplomatic career, he had travelled abroad, and he's said to have been delighted with the buildings that he saw in Italy. And so came back and created this extraordinary wing of the castle as the intended, seemingly the intended beginnings of a new house on the site. At the time of his death, though, in the late 16th century, of the plague, tragically, the building was not completed, and so members of the family struggled to finish it in a slightly haphazard way. If you look at some of the details which are off-shot here on that elevation, you can see that there are sort of great differences in terms of the original intention, which is visible in the details of this main facade. But this is a one-off. Shropshire didn't produce big houses of this type on a consistent basis at that very early date. And that particularly early date is just before Bess of Hardwick builds Hardwick Hall in Derbyshire. This is an incredible building, very important building for its time. We know that the family did occupy it, but at the time of the Civil Wars, the building was slighted. In the 18th century, the family thought about rebuilding it. There's actually a plan in the collection at Shrewsbury School for John Hiram Haycock's vision of rebuilding Moreton Corbet Castle in the 1790s. But instead, the Corbets decided to settle themselves at other properties on their estates. We've heard about the Shawbury Players' play that's forthcoming at Acton Burnell Hall, and if you want to go and see that play, you'll also get a rather good appreciation of Acton Burnell Hall, which I show you in this photograph here. Acton Burnell is essentially an early 17th century house built for the Corbets at the time, it seems, when they gave up living at Moreton Corbet Castle. But it's a building that they worked on in successive generations, as with so many of our country houses. We know in the late 18th century, the then Corbet had chimney pieces made for it by John Hiram Haycock. He also did quite a large-scale rebuilding of the house at that time. The Haycocks were very sensitive to the building, though, and it's very difficult to actually decipher their work from the genuine 17th century. And again, John Hiram Haycock's son, Edward Haycock, went and worked on the house in the 1840s, and then there was a later building work on the house by an architect called G.H. Birch, who was at one time the curator of the Sir John Soanes Museum in London. He worked on the house in the 1890s in a very much an arts and crafts style. So it's a house that's had a lot of reworking over the different years. Another interesting house, a very early 17th century date, existed just outside of Basschurch, and that was Bratton Hall, a house which in its form of a very large open C shape with towers at the corners with these wonderful pyramid roofs at the top of them. It was a house which took its cue from Old Wimbledon House in London, a long-lost mansion, but a very influential mansion which had been built by members of the Cecil family and which had those same towers at the corners. In the latter 17th century, following the Civil Wars, when the Hunt family acquired the estate, the Hunts effected quite a considerable rebuilding. They almost certainly put the pitched roof on it, this hipped roof, which runs around the house, as you can see it in this 19th century engraving of the building. But unfortunately, the Hunts, as time progressed, gained in their wealth from minerals and also from the sugar trade, because they had plantations over in the East Indies, so of course were involved in the slave trade as well as a result of their dealings over there. And so in the middle years of the 19th century, they decided to demolish half of this building, which survives only in fragmentary form today as Bratton Hall. And they built themselves a new house on a higher site within the Deer Park at Bratton in the 1850s to the designs of a Sheffield architect, Waitman, Goldie and Hadfield. It's a very uncompromising Victorian house. One might even be tempted to describe it as institutional. And in fact, when one realises a little bit more about the history of the house and its occupation, its use, it does have very much an institutional look about it. The family only lived there for one generation. After that one generation, the house became a private lunatic asylum. And it then became a borstal, a reform school, and then eventually it came into the hands of PGL, the Children's Activity Centre, and it's in that use that the house survives today. But it is an extraordinary building. It survives with many of its service areas intact because the family had not been living there, they'd not been wealthy enough to continually change it, and because it was serving a purpose during war years when it might otherwise have been altered or even demolished, it's retained its plan extraordinarily well. Not the prettiest of our county houses, though. A much prettier house in the Tudor style, though, is the picture that I'm showing you here. It's a painting by William Linton, and it shows Hardwick Grange, which was a house that stood until the 1930s, just to the north of Hadnall. Hardwick Grange was built by a Chester architect, Thomas Harrison of Chester, an architect who did a lot of work in the Greek Revival style in Chester, He did the Grosvenor Bridge there, he did the Skirton Bridge in Lancaster, and occasionally he had little forays into the Tudor style, and Hardwick Grange was one of those. His other house, which was on another estate associated with the same family of his client here, was the Citadel at Hawkstone, built as a dower house for the Hill family at Hawkstone. And this house was built for Rowland Hill. Rowland Hill, Viscount Hill, as he became, of Hawkstone and Almarez. And it was the home of the general of Wellington's general, Rowland Hill. He's commemorated in the church at Hadnall as being not only a great soldier, but also a great farmer. And he created a number of little small holdings on the estate at Hardwick, some of which can still be seen on the left-hand side heading north on the A49. But his house at Hardwick was a rather charming one. What he didn't reckon for, though, was that when farming wasn't doing quite so well, his descendants, the Hills of Hawkstone, would flog Hardwick, and it would be sold to an industrialist who, of course, in the agricultural depression of the late 19th century, had the money and the wherewithal. And so it was sold to the Bibby family, a Liverpool shipping and agricultural feed family, who had an enormous amount of wealth to throw at the house, and they doubled its size, building on to the original villa, which you can see on the right-hand side here, with this colossal great extension to the designs of an architect called C.J. Ferguson from Carlisle. Unsurprisingly, having a large house like this, and in fact not one house but two houses, because James Jenkinson Bibby, who built the extension onto this, also bought the Sansor estate next door from the Gardner family. So in the 30s, when money was slightly tighter, they decided to demolish this house, albeit that the estate is still owned by the same family who today live at Sansor, the main house. Now, we've made reference to the Hills of Hawkstone, and here indeed is Hawkstone Hall, their family home to the north of Shrewsbury. A complex building. Although it appears to be all of a Georgian date, there are several successive generations of Hill family at work on the building there. And in fact, the Hills bought Hawkstone back in 1549. The first Protestant Lord Mayor of London, Sir Rowland Hill, who still sits in restored form on the top of his column in the park at Hawkstone, was the purchaser of the estate. But things really got going in the late 17th century when Richard Hill of Hawkstone was the deputy paymaster to the Duke of Marlborough in his campaigns. And Richard Hill was given the troops money a year in advance so he could invest it. As long as the troops got paid at the end of the year, he could keep any of the money that he made from the investments. And he did very well, to the extent that his family described it as lucrative arithmetic when he was doing all of these deals. And he established not only his nephew with Hawkstone, the family seat, but also another nephew with an estate called Turn, which later became Attingham, and another estate in Staffordshire called Shenston, which went to another nephew, Samuel Barber, who changed his name to Hill. Hawkstone, though, was altered by Richard Hill. He added basically the main block here of these 9 bays, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 2 stories, and he added porticos to each side. His nephew, who then inherited the estate from him, Sir Rowland Hill, the first baronet, added on the little turrets and made the house much more Palladian in its feeling. It was probably he who also added a great saloon that I'm going to show you in a moment. And his descendants in the early 19th century brought in other architects, Lewis Wyatt, for instance, in the Regency period, who added this great drawing room or ballroom to the one side, and a conservatory passage which leads up to what was originally the chapel in this wing here. So a lot of change had taken place in the house before the Hill family finally sold it in the late 19th century, victims of family circumstances and the agricultural depression. And it went through 2 different private hands before being bought by the Order of Redemptorists, the Catholic order, which are currently, in fact, marketing the house for sale. So again, if you're feeling flush, if you've got, in this case, £5 million, Hawkstone could be yours. And with Hawkstone, you'd get this rather wonderful saloon, almost certainly the most important room within the house, a great room of the middle years of the 18th century, probably designed by Henry Flitcroft for the family, with allegorical paintings set into plasterwork, and on the wall that is facing the chimney piece, so it's off-shot on our right, there is a great painting which shows the siege of Namur, great siege, part of the battles associated with Marlborough, in which Richard Hill of Hawkstone was paymaster, and he's depicted in that picture. Over on the east side of the county used to stand a rather interesting building. and there are only fragmentary remains there. Many of us go and visit this particular house without even realising it. We go through it on, in my case, a daily basis, because the M54 motorway runs straight through its site. And this is Tong Castle, a building which is depicted here in the 1730s, and showing a very interesting building, which is essentially an early 16th century brick house, and a very early brick house at that, which had been built by Sir Henry Vernon, a man who owned not only Tong, but also Haddon in Derbyshire, and was also associated with the Hodness estate at that time as well. He rebuilt the house in about 1500, and it would have been the earliest brick house in the county to survive, had it survived, with these rather wonderful crenellations and turrets, crow-stepped gables on the sides here, eminently fashionable, and something which we would expect for Sir Henry, because he was intimately connected with the royal court at the time. In the 17th century, the estate passed to the Pierpoint family, who owned estates in Nottinghamshire. They evidently had some interest in Tong, because this rather interesting Ionic portico, which was probably the earliest classical portico in Shropshire, almost certainly in the first half of the 17th century, so very, very early, that appears on the castle at that time. But they lost interest because they had other estates in the East Midlands, and so in the middle years of the 18th century, they sold the estate to a Havana sugar merchant, George Durant, who came back very wealthy and decided to buy himself an estate. He haggled very much over Tong and the Kingstons, and there's quite interesting correspondence in the University of Nottingham's library of his haggling. But when he finally got hold of the estate, he pruned the original Vernon Castle and had a new facade superimposed onto it to the designs almost certainly of Capability Brown. Capability Brown was brought in to landscape the park at Tong, and his landscaping does in part still survive there, including Church Pool, which you can see from the A41 opposite the church there. But it would have been the most extraordinary building, built of local stone, apparently on very insubstantial foundations, unfortunately. It was rather jerry-built from the start. And we know that when the estate was sold in the 1850s and was bought by the Earls of Bradford at Weston, they toyed with the idea even then of demolishing the house, because of course they had Weston Park next door. They had no need of another house. But the house lingered on with tenants living in it until the early years of the 20th century, when it was finally found to be in such poor repair that when there was a sale of the contents, the staircase within it collapsed. And that was to be the final straw. The lead was stripped from the roofs, chimney pieces were taken out, fittings were taken out, and the building was then left to rot. And it rotted, and unfortunately in the 1950s, a young boy, a local lad, was playing in the ruins and fell to his death. So it was then decided that it wasn't just an eyesore on the estate, as was then perceived, but it was also a dangerous structure. And so the local TA were brought in to put detonation charges into it, and as a training exercise, Tong was blown up. And the Bradford Estate Office have some rather unfortunate photographs showing a ruined ivy-mantled facade in one shot. The next shot shows a cloud of smoke coming up from underneath the castle as the charges are fired, and the final shot shows a pile of rubble as the facade has crumbled. Very, very sad, and the archaeological remains that still survive on site to either side of the motorway give an indication of the importance of this building before it was altered and sadly lost. On a happier note, though, a house which did, in the 1980s, go through a bit of a wobble period where it was questioned as to whether or not it would indeed survive. It was on English Heritage's Buildings at Risk register, and that's Acton Hall near Shrewsbury, which has happily been restored and is now once again lived in as a family home. This is a very important house for Shropshire because it was built in 1703 as really the start of a series of Baroque houses in Shropshire of a certain type. These very tall brick houses with stone dressings on them, which have very much a great sort of air of Dutch canal houses and of European architecture, which are finding their way into the English countryside. It's an important house because it was built by the Cressett family, who had, in the 16th century, built themselves quite an important brick house, an early brick house, at Upton Cressett, near Bridge North. But having acquired estates near Shrewsbury, they decided to go closer to the county town with the building of Upton Cressett Hall, designed for them by the surveyor of the Marylebone estate of the Dukes of Portland, a man called John Prince. And John Prince's elevation survives, a drawing which shows the house, shows it with a very lofty mansard roof rising up above that parapet there, very much a Dutch-influenced building. The mansard roof's gone. The house has been altered over different generations, most recently really in the early 20th century when the McCorquodale family lived there. And they probably employed the very fashionable decorators Lenigans to make a lot of changes to the interior. What survives within from the 18th century, though, is a spectacular staircase, which is a so-called flying staircase, because one of the flights actually flies up between the lower and the upper flight without actually touching a wall. So there's no cantilevering into the wall. It's solely supported on those other flights, almost certainly with iron structure, which of course would have been readily available in Shropshire in the 18th century. But Cwm style finds its way throughout the county. And one of the families who are great propagators of that Baroque style are the Smith family, a family of masons and architects who originated in Warwick. They'd worked for the great British architect James Gibbs, and they've really imbibed his style of building. And this particular house, which dates from the first decades of the 18th century, was almost certainly built by the Smiths of Warwick. This is Acton Hall, which was originally built as an heir-in-waiting's house for the owners of the later owners of the Aldenham estate nearby. It was built for Whitmore Acton, who later became Sir Whitmore Acton on his father's death when he moved into the big house at Aldenham. But it's thought that his aunt had quite a play in the building of this building, and he was possibly building it with the intention that she would remain there, almost as a sort of dower house. His aunt Hester was the widow of a London merchant, a very rich woman in her own right, and it seems that she almost certainly paid for a lot of the construction of the building. But because this was a secondary house on another estate, it was very little altered. It wasn't the showplace that the family wanted to entertain their guests in, to show them how innovative they were in terms of architectural style. So it survives remarkably unaltered. And now, with some rather wonderful gardens around it that the present owners, the Kennedy family, have created there. Perhaps the most spectacular of the Smith of Warwick associated houses in Shropshire, though, is located near Clibbery Mortimer, and that's Morley Hall, a house which was built for a Catholic family, the Blunt family, Sir Edward Blunt, the 4th Baronet, who had the house built on what was essentially the estate belonging to Soddington Manor in Worcestershire. But he rather conveniently for us crossed the county border and built this spectacular house at that position. It's a house where it's almost certain that the owner's own influences were thrown into it in its building. Every one of those facades of the house, as you walk around it, is completely different. And it borrows architectural references from known Italian buildings that Sir Edward would almost certainly have seen on his grand tour. When you go inside Morley, though, you get the real treatment. It's a spectacular display of the very finest craftsmanship of the early years of the 18th century. And unsurprisingly, because some of the best craftsmen of the time were employed on its building. We know that the joiners, Thomas Eberall, Edward Poynton, were employed, who also worked with Smith of Warwick on other houses that he worked on. And also Francesco Vasari, a plasterer who had worked in England at Hagley Hall in Worcestershire. He was brought to do this extraordinary plasterwork that you can see on the walls of the staircase there. The staircase itself is the most amazing piece of joinery. The handrail, serpentine, undulating, following the flights, and then meeting at the bottom, just off shot on the right-hand image there, with a great serpent's head and a little ivory ball in its mouth. Wonderful details to it. It really is spectacular. Close to us here, though, if we followed the River Severn upstream, and on our right-hand side, we would find ourselves looking at the site of this house here. This is Berwick House, a house which was rebuilt in probably about 1731 for Thomas Powys, who had bought the estate of Berwick in 1728. And this Ingleby watercolour of the late 18th century shows the facade of the Smith of Warwick house that he built at Berwick. Very quiet and actually quite modest-sized house. Rather charming view. The little temple in the background there you can just see on the left-hand side, and the man with his dog by the hayricks there. Berwick, though, was sold by the Powys family in the 1870s. In 1875, it was bought by James Watson, who was an MP for Shrewsbury. He was a manufacturer from Birmingham, and he brought in a Birmingham architect, Osborne and Reading, to rebuild the house, as should be suitable for a Member of Parliament and a country gent who has made his fortune in the Black Country. So the quiet Smith of Warwick house, which had been there with its little parapet and facades, was sort of Italified with an Italianate look, with balustrading put upon the roof, the pilasters decorated, terraced gardens in front of it. And if we look at Berwick from above, we realise that once little quiet house has become something of the Georgian oyster caught up, the Georgian pearl caught up in a big Victorian oyster. There is that Smith of Warwick facade with that hipped roof, and here around the back, the drawing rooms and the dining room of the house, all added on to cater for large Victorian households that James Watson would have had within the house there. Up near Oswestry, the Smiths of Warwick were also busy at this house here, known in this engraving as Porkington. We today know the site as Brogyntyn. It was the home of the Owen family, who even in the late 17th century had started building in a classical style with this pedimented range that you can see on the right-hand side. If we look at the next image, you can see the classical range with its 2 bays under a pediment has now had a rather smart new block built in front of it for William Owen by Francis Smith of Warwick in about 1731. Brogyntyn, though, was a house that never stopped growing. And so in the early years of the 19th century, the heiress of the house, Mary Jane Ormsby, having married an Irishman, William Gore, added onto the house, had the house rendered in Roman cement, and a great portico built on by Benjamin Gummo, a Rhuavan architect, with a Codestone coat of arms in the pediment up there. Codestone being the same material that poor old Lord Hill on his column is also made from. It's a ceramic material which can be used for architectural detailing. The house, though, had an additional wing added on the north side in the 1870s for J.R. Ormsby Gore, who later became the first Lord Hardwick. And the Hardwick family gave the house up, finally selling it in the 1990s. And it is now very much an empty building, unfortunately, but a building which, like some of those others I've shown you today, is currently on the market. So dig deep, folks, dig deep. A very sophisticated country house exists just outside Newport. This building is now the junior boarding house for the Adams Grammar School. Lucky Adams Grammar School having this building, and I'm sure for those children who are lucky enough to be in it, it'll be an architectural inspiration to them as they grow up. Longford Hall is a very sophisticated house designed by Joseph Bonomi, an architect who'd worked with Robert Adam. We see it in the top left image there, a Moses Griffith watercolour, just after it had been completed in the 1790s, designed for Ralph Leake, who was a nabob, a man who'd made his money in the East India Company, came back to Shropshire. His family were originally from Wellington, but they heard that the Earl of Shrewsbury was a little bit hard up and was selling the Longford estate. So they rushed in and bought it and built this gem of a house. It's not an enormous house at all. And in fact, this image here shows you a 19th century 2-bay wing that's been added onto it. So imagine it without those 2 bays. It's a real jewel. And when you look at the plan of the house, you come to appreciate that by the late 18th century, people building houses were thinking about much more compact plans. So you've got here under the portico, or porte cochere, because you could put a carriage through there, get out dry shod. You've got a vestibule, a staircase rising up in a single flight, a drawing room, dining room, breakfast room, dressing room and study, and then a butler's pantry. So there you've got the service wing stretching off. It's not a huge house, it's a very, very manageable building. And very interesting, as also not only being a house which has one vista, looking out in one direction, but in keeping with the ideals of the picturesque movement, which in the late 18th century, early 19th century, came to encourage builders of houses to build them to be an ornament in the landscape and also to use the landscape. So this house has a view on not only the entrance side, but also on the side and on this side here as well. So there's just a small interference of that service wing. We've even got views from the dining room window in that direction. So it's a house that's really positioned to take advantage of its landscape. Attingham, though, by contrast, just 10 years earlier than Longford, is a house that is woefully out of date in terms of its architectural detailing. And some of the reasons behind that are, of course, because, as those of you that know the house will appreciate, Attingham was built by Noel Hill, First Lord Berwick, to actually conceal an earlier family home which used to exist in this area here. Basically, that balustrade at the back of the house is the back wall, and the house itself used to occupy this space here, known as Turn Hall. Turn Hall was the original family home, and for reasons of economy, as well as sort of grandeur in building a house that would be seen from the Turn Bridge and the London Holyhead Road, Noel Hill instructed his architect, the Gaelic-speaking Scots architect George Stewart, to build a grand main block in a C shape around it, and then to build these outlying pavilions to really disguise the fact that there was lurking within that a much earlier building which was serving for day-to-day family accommodation and service accommodation. But within the house at Attingham, the interiors are spectacular. The Stuart interiors that survived from the 1780s are wonderful for their plasterwork by Joseph Bromfield of Shrewsbury, and in the case of the circular boudoir, for very fine painted decoration, very much in the French style of the late 18th century. At the centre of the house, though, there is the most extraordinary space shown in the proposal drawing for it by A.C. Puget, working for John Nash, the Prince Regent's architect, and then a mid-19th century watercolour of what actually was built there, a watercolour, in fact, by Lady Hester Leake, one of the Leake family from Longford, the house that we've just seen. Nash was brought in by the second Lord Berwick to create a vast picture gallery for the display of paintings that he brought back on his grand tour. And so, removing 3 staircases, he found himself enclosed by Old Turn Hall on the one side and the new Stuart House on the other. The only way to light the picture gallery was by putting in top lighting and a cast iron cove cast locally at local forges to afford light to come into the space below. As some of you will know, there is at the moment a massive restoration project going on at Attingham because cast iron doesn't always maintain its form in different temperatures. And so leaking has been an unfortunate feature of the picture gallery at Attingham since it was first created. And I think that's something which a future speaker is going to be talking to you about, so I will cut short my talk on Nash at Attingham. But Nash, whilst working on the Attingham estate, was also designing interesting cottages in the village. And next door to the Mitten and Mermaid, this interesting row of cottages are in fact depicted in a gouache painting in the collection at Attingham, originally with a porch running their length and another little dormer window here. A set of picturesque cottages intended for workers on the estate, something which predates Nash's later work at Blaise Hamlet near Bristol, which is much better known than these rather fun cottages in Attingham. Also on the Attingham estate, built for the second Lord Berwick, or more correctly for his steward, Francis Walford, John Nash was maintained as architect, designing Cronk Hill, as a splendidly interesting building, which was in fact added on to an existing earlier timber-framed farmhouse that survives in the wing that's on the left here. It's a building which is truly picturesque, intended to be an incident within the landscape and to involve the landscape in all the views from the rooms for entertaining around the ground floor. But it's interesting because it's the earliest building of its kind in the Italianate style in Britain. Its design was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1802 by John Nash, originally in fact for a longer main block. He curtailed the size of that in execution. But he created a building derived from the paintings that Lord Berwick would have presumably brought back in his baggage, or if not paintings, copies of paintings, by Claude Lorraine and Poussin. Buildings of a Quattrocento style, like a Tuscan farmhouse with a round tower, possibly originally for defence, but here used to create something that's of visual interest within the landscape. The round tower, though, is purely ornamental. That chimney stack there, in fact, should be on the other side of the tower. But the flue winds its way around to find its way out through there, so that the chimney stack doesn't disturb the line of the building and its conical roof. It's a wonderful piece of stage scenery, effectively. Nash was very good at stage scenery, and only 2 miles away from Cronk Hill, for an ancient established family, the Burtons of Longner, who had been living on their estate there for over 450 years, he was commissioned to replace their genuine Tudor manor house with a Tudor Gothic style house. Originally, Nash's first design to the Burtons was for a castellated building, but the landscape gardener Humphrey Repton, who was also working at Longner at the same time, something of an unfortunate thing, because Repton and Nash had at one stage been in partnership, were by that stage bitter enemies. And so the red book that Repton produced for his designs of the park, of which I show you the plan here below, this was a red Morocco-bound book showing designs of the landscape. In the red book, he rails against Nash and says, you know, this dreadful man, well, he doesn't say this dreadful man, he says, this architect that you have chosen. He never refers to him by name, but calls him this architect. But makes a lot of references to the house, because Nash wanted to build it further to the west than the original site of the house, which you can see here. and Repton uses the Red Book to justify keeping the old house's site, saying that the house should be a manor house where the lord of the soil lives amongst his tenants. Quite a political statement at that time, because England was still at war with France when this house was built. It was part of the Napoleonic Wars of the time. So money and building of great country houses was thought to be something that you should do very carefully, because in England we didn't want a revolution as they'd had in France, and there were genuine fears that this was something that could happen. So Repton, in the Red Book, urges Nash and his client to build economically, and indeed that was what happened with the house as built. There's a wonderful correspondence that exists in the collection at Longner Hall between the architect and the patron. And this is one of Nash's letters from his home at Stokesay Castle on the Isle of Wight, referring to the stained glass window that Betton and Evans were going to produce for the staircase, and details of the staircase balustrade, rather charming little incidental on the drawing. Not far from Longner, just about a mile and a half to the north, used to stand this house that I'm showing you here. This is Moses Griffith's watercolour, showing Sundorne House, as it then was, the home of the Corbet family in the 1790s. It was an early 18th century house that the Corbets had engaged the architect Robert Milne to alter with bay windows that were added onto the front in the 1770s. But it was an ancient estate. The Corbets had inherited it from the Kinnistons. They in turn had ultimately inherited from the Barkers. The Barkers had been the owners of Hormond Abbey after the dissolution, and they lived in some of the domestic ranges at Hormond Abbey. So it had within its park this romantic ruin of the Abbey. It also, on the edge of Hormond Hill, until in fact the 1930s, had this rather splendid folly, Hormond Castle, which was designed by Robert Milne whilst he was working at the house. And so the Corbets, who were of an ancient family, decided they should show this in their seat. And so Mrs. Corbet, together with the then Archdeacon of Salop, the Reverend Hugh Owen, Archdeacon Hugh Owen, altered the house to make it Gothic. So you can see there those bay windows that we saw on the classical front, now rendered higher and with battlements on top, and battlements on the whole structure. But sometimes things get given away, and if you go around the back of the house, which is usually the best way to look at a house, you peep at that rather wonderful crenellated octagonal tower, all those battlements. It's quite bewildering, but you look in that corner there, you can just see there's an arched-headed Georgian sash window. So they weren't quite so thorough as they perhaps should have been. Sadly though, that photograph, which is top right on the screen, was a National Monuments Record photograph taken in the 1950s, just prior to the demolition of the majority of the castle. Great shame. Parts of the building, including the little chapel, still survive, and the gatehouse there, are waiting a new life. In the south of the county though, whilst others were building in the Gothic style in Shropshire, the Forrester family at Willey decided to engage themselves in the building of a very grand classical house on a new site. And Willey Park, as their home is known, was the result. This spectacular building on a very romantic site overlooking a chain of pools was built for the family in 1813 to 1820, using the services of Lewis Wyatt, an architect who'd also worked for the Hills at Hawkstone, but who at that time, critically, was the labourer in trust at Carlton House, the Prince Regent's house in London. So he was a very good name to conjure with. Cecil Forrester had married the daughter of the Duke of Rutland, Lady Catherine Manners, and so he had to build a fairly smart house to rather prove himself in society. He was the political agent in Shrewsbury. He was the man who was responsible for getting Disraeli elected as our MP in Shrewsbury, as Disraeli's second seat in Parliament. And he built this very, very grand house, which at the time that it was built was thought to be one of the most expensive houses built in Britain. The architect, C.R. Cockerell, commented about the interiors of the house, this wonderful top-lit central hall with scagliola columns running along the sides of it, the great apsidal-ended library, which has on the other side the bay window that you saw with the columns around it in the previous slide. C.R. Cockerell said that he thought that Willey was the most expensive house built in Britain at that time. He could think of nowhere else which had been so costly in terms of expenditure. A really wonderful house, a house which retains most of its original contents, its original hangings. It's a spectacular, a very little known treasure that we have in the county. In the 1830s though, people were still building in the classical style. And this watercolour by Mrs. Stackhouse Acton is at one time, in one instance, heralding a new dawn, but at the same time an obituary for the old timber-framed house of the Moore family, which you can see on the right-hand side of the image. The old house was about to come down and the new was about to be built. The new being built for the Reverend Robert Norgrave Pemberton, the rector of Church Stretton, designed by Edward Haycock of Shrewsbury. It overlooks a rather wonderful garden, and this temple, designed by George Stewart, the architect of Attingham, built in the 1770s as a memorial to one of the Moore family. There is the house today. It's a house which, in fact, is currently being worked on by the current owners, who, the father of whom made a lot of alterations to the house in the 1960s, when the original entrance, which you can see here, underneath that great portico, there was originally a little stubby pair of columns which led into an entrance hall that still survives, its original chimney piece, and steps which originally led right up into the centre of the house. That was all got rid of in the 60s as a part of a process of making the house at that time more livable. They also demolished a wing of the house, but the son of that alterer, who now lives there with his wife, has currently got the builders in, and they're building a colonnade to replace the wing which was demolished with Greek Doric columns to link up to a surviving pavilion and to make a number of other changes to the house, including the restoration of the giant dining room in the house, which had previously in the 60s been divided into kitchen and dining room. So there's a lot of changes taking place there even now. This house, Oakley Park, near Ludlow, is a very important classical house and a very interesting house because it was built over various different dates. It was an estate that was bought by Clive of India and one of several in Shropshire that he acquired along with Walcot. And it was a house which in his grandson's time, the Honourable Robert Henry Clive, was reworked again on 2 occasions using the architect C.R. Cockerell. Cockerell and Robert Henry Clive were both founder members of the Travellers' Club in Pall Mall, interested in travelling, interested in archaeology, and so they took an earlier Georgian building and very subtly altered it on the entrance front, in fact giving it 2 porticos with columns which have direct references to Delian Doric columns on ancient Greek sites. But what's really exciting about the house is when you go inside and you go through a circular entrance hall and into this great staircase hall at the heart of the house, where most of the details are direct references to current archaeology at that time. The columns derived from the Temple of Apollo at Bassai, and other architectural details, that great frieze over the columns there, the columns supporting the gallery, derived from the Temple of the Winds at Athens. It's a fascinating house. Fascinating as well for the art collection, which includes Benjamin West's great painting up here of Clive of India receiving the Diwani, a painting originally intended for Claremont, Clive's house in Surrey, and a picture that was so big that when the house was being designed, C.R. Cockerell had to sweep back the rail of the balustrade there to accommodate the picture at the upper level. Within the house, though, there's other interesting rooms that survive from an earlier period. The drawing room now was originally the dining room, and it's got plaster decoration by Joseph Bromfield, probably done originally for the first Lord Clive, Robert Henry Clive's father. And in the library of the house, there is a direct Indian reference with the chimney piece, which is made of an extraordinary green marble with lotus leaf columns. Now, this is something that provoked a great correspondence between the client and the architect, because the Greek revival-focused architect didn't like the idea of that. He thought it was terribly impure to include it within the house. Not far from Oakley is Downton Hall. We might not have a Downton Abbey in Shropshire, but we have a Downton Hall, and a very splendid one it is too. This is a house which, in the early 18th century, the 1730s, as I show you the elevation here, was originally built for Redenhall Pierce. He built this rather splendid east-facing front. His son then came along and altered the house. The original front that he had designed, you've just seen up here. Son William Pierce Hall came along and turned the house round and built bay windows onto the side, and this then became the entrance front. The house in later generations, when it was inherited by the Hall's descendants, the Rouse-Boughtons, they turned the house round again. And so Edward Haycock of Shrewsbury in the 1820s created this wonderful portico and then Pantheon-like entrance hall, you can see there, dining room and a conservatory, the very fashionable early 19th century conceit for the house to have. The result of all that is you've got an incredibly interesting set of interiors. This is the saloon, which was built for William Pierce Hall by Thomas Farnes Pritchard of Shrewsbury. You've got a really special chimney piece there with all sorts of different coloured marbles in it. Plaster work framing the paintings and on the ceiling up there. If we zoom in, you can see the detail of some of the plaster work. It's really spectacular. wonderful sense of animation going on with it. That's the elevation that Thomas Fowles Pritchard did for the entrance front, which was actually unexecuted. But ever resourceful, as architects tend to be, Thomas Fowles Pritchard took that drawing into Ludlow and managed to persuade Somerset Davies to adopt it for his rather smart house on Broad Street. So if you're going down Broad Street to the Broadgate there, it's the very fine house on the left-hand side on your way down. So it was recycled, effectively, in its use. This is the drawing room at Downton. The chimney piece there, that's a detail of it, showing a boar hunt. That chimney piece figures in Thomas Fowles Pritchard's Book of Drawings, which is now in the Architectural Library in Washington, DC. And that's the Pantheon entrance hall at Downton, which Haycock designed. In the late 19th century, though, when the estate at Downton was owned by the Rathboughtons, many of the traditional landowners in the county, as I've already mentioned, who were agriculturally reliant, found themselves in a position that their land incomes from agriculture were insufficient to sustain their lifestyle, and so they would surreptitiously sell portions of the outlying estates. The Earls of Powys did that with an outlying portion of their Montford estates, which were ultimately, in part, bought by Mrs. Rebecca Derby of the Derby family from Coalbrookdale. She'd been born a Quaker, she turned church, she lived with her, she was a widow, she lived with her brothers, the Christie family, the Christie Towling family, who were great collectors, and she built the designs of Richard Norman Shaw, the rather wonderful Adcott, now of course a girls' school to the northwest of Shrewsbury, and a building which incorporates interesting elements of earlier architecture, details which might be derived from even perhaps the Whitehall, those triple gables, or Benthall Hall has been suggested by John Newman in his revision of Pevsner. But it's a superb house, these great little incidental details like the half timbering peeping out there on the elevation which faces the entrance. And then on the garden side, that great cage of glass which marks what should effectively be a great hall, but is in effect just a great living room, a full height living room at that, but a much reduced plan for family occupation. As the 20th century rolled on, though, the fate of the English country house is something which, rather poignantly this year, we do think a lot about, because this year marks the 40th anniversary of a great exhibition which was held at the V&A, the destruction of the English country house, which was very much a political exhibition, set up by Roy Strong, John Harris, and Marcus Binney, who went on to found the conservation body Save Britain's Heritage. It was an exhibition which drew everyone's attention to the plight that country houses were facing, and particularly in the 1950s, the demolitions of houses. This particular house was one of the houses that was featured in it. This Ingleby watercolour of the 1790s wasn't used, but this is, I'm using it to show the progression of the building there. A C-shaped building at Onslow, to the west of Shrewsbury. A jetted timber frame construction wing there, almost certainly, that you can see, onto which was added, for the Morehall family, who later owned the estate, this block here, probably by Thomas Fowles Pritchard of Shrewsbury. If you go to St Mary's in Shrewsbury, there's a wonderful Thomas Fowles Pritchard monument to Mary Morehall of Onslow, and it seems very likely that he was the architect of these alterations there. This spectacular ceiling survived up until the 1950s of the dining room designed for the Morehall family, and it has stylistic similarities with plasterwork at other houses that Pritchard worked upon. The estate was sold by the Morehalls and bought eventually by the Wingfield family in the 1770s, and Rowland Wingfield, who bought it, initially commissioned some designs from George Stewart, the architect of Attingham. This is one of the drawings for it, which Stewart was not able to persuade the Wingfields to take on. But he, rather like Pritchard, as we saw at Downton, sold this drawing on to Joshua Blakeway, and Lithwood Hall at Baston Hill was based on that same design when that was eventually built, another house which is sadly mostly no longer there. Onslow, though, was rebuilt in 1820, eventually, for Rowland Wingfield's son, Colonel John Wingfield, designed by Edward Haycock of Shrewsbury, uncompromising Greek Doric portico that you see here. But a very sad photograph, because in 1955, the family, having moved out of the house for a girls' school in the Second World War, decided they would not be able to move back. Increased taxation, the cost of staff, building licenses, all sorts of problems thrown at the country house owner. And so they decided reluctantly that they would demolish their family home. And these very, very emotional photographs really show the house in its final stages. You can see men on the roof stripping the lead. You can see the imperial staircase stacked up, ready to go on the lawn there. All the windows have gone, glazing bars out of the windows, there'd been a demolition sale, it was all disappearing. A very, very sad picture, but it wasn't the end. The family decided to build a new house on the site, but the house that they built in 1960 was a house that the then owner, Charles Wingfield, decided was going to be the house to withstand the 20th century. It was a house that would require minimal maintenance. It was brick, it had an aluminium roof, and it had crystal window frames. It wouldn't have won a beauty contest, but it did do its job, and it saw the family through his generation. After his death, his son and successor and his wife decided that the time had perhaps come to improve the view so far as people coming up the drive was concerned, and also to improve the way in which the house functioned, because the rooms in the 1960s house were very cramped, and they had paintings and furniture, and in fact chimney pieces from the Haycock house in that house. So the Wingfields took the very bold step of getting consent for the demolition of the 60s house, which didn't, strangely enough, take too much persuading. But the difficulty was, of course, getting planning consent to build something else in a countryside site. Thankfully, though, when John Gummer was the Environment Secretary, he brought in PPG 7 legislation, which enables exceptional houses to be built on sites where they would not normally be considered. And this is one such example with the new house at Onslow Park, which was designed by Craig Hamilton, an architect who's done work for the Prince of Wales, who's now clocking up awards at a rate of knots on every building that he works on. So we're very lucky that he has been involved in this project in Shropshire, designing a new house there, taking some of the best bits of the old house in terms of the interior, and creating something that is very much livable from the family's 21st century point of view. It's a house which is a 21st century evocation of some of the Palladio's Veneto villas, with a little bit of Schinkel, the German classical architect, thrown in, and a house which has, unsurprisingly, as a bold new gesture, won an award for Craig Hamilton with the Georgian Group last year. So the English country house in Shropshire is very much a living tradition. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. I've lived in this county for 44 years now. One or two of those houses I knew, the vast majority I didn't, to be quite honest. Absolutely fascinating. I think we've all had a wonderful lecture this morning. Thank you very much indeed. I'm aware of time getting on. Are there any questions to our speaker? I think you don't want to compromise your knowledge of the county. We have a gentleman here, I think, who just about knows it all. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you all next month. And the talk is about Her Majesty.
Well,